Hello, everyone. My name is Jonas Butler, and I'm a practicing master's level therapist. And I wanted to take some time to talk about the last video I made, specifically about not being able to know yourself. And while I still think that that's ultimately true, I wanted to talk about the ways to circumvent that so that you can sort of come to understand yourself a little bit better and control your own life. Know thyself. This maxim has existed for over 2,500 years and has been used to elucidate a journey of introspection. While the term may be seen as vague or short, its ability to resonate has been applicable across time and culture to symbolize our commitment to attaining something that has frequently been described as approximating heaven. But the methods that are physiologically endowed to us show that we may be too vulnerable to a plethora of factors such as cognitive biases and environmental distractions which impede understanding. And as I mentioned in my last video, the culmination of this intrapsychic ignorance can lead us to places that are far removed from where we desire to be. So, if you believe in these ideas, then at a certain point you need to begin to ask yourself, do I have any control of my own life? That might sound like a rhetorical question, but it's a natural response to the dynamics we're talking about, and there is a matter-of-fact answer. You do control your own life, and you do have control over the lives of others, because your behaviors exist objectively in the world. For instance, if you have a simple habit like opening the door for people when you're going into a certain location, then smiling while you do it, then people are going to build up a profile about you. If that habit makes itself apparent at places like work or school, then you're distinguished as someone who is pleasant, both because you are objectively being considerate and because other people will notice that. Now, the key idea here isn't just to be nice to people, it's to say that the more that you act in this way, the more you accumulate these experiences, the more you embody this type of person, and the more you know that you are that type of person. But maybe most importantly, it's a behavior that you can control. And to take it a step further, there's even evidence to suggest that things like smiling can make you happier and appear more attractive. So the way that you act in the world actually has an internal component when you act externally, and that can amalgamate over time and become either good or bad. But, as I mentioned before, it's not just about you, you also control the lives of others as well. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's take a look back at the example with the doors and the smiling. Because of your actions, you've invited the other person who you're opening the door for into a pleasant situation and experience that can lead to them feeling better about what they're doing. As we discussed in the last video, mood can be greatly flexible and have an outstanding influence on our perspectives. Now, you really shouldn't underestimate what something seemingly small like that can do for another person in that moment, because the outcome of that has the potential to significantly change the course of their day. And if it does, then that means you had a primary role in helping with that, which does actually technically fit the definition of control. It means that you had an influence in the way that their day went post that event, and a primary one at that. Now let's bring all of that together. If you are a person who is happy, and you're happy because you're acting that way at work, let's say you're the person who's opening the doors and then you smile while you do it and that makes you feel better about yourself, and that corresponds to everybody else's opinion of you as somebody who is happy and opens the door for other people, then that means that you are getting maybe the beginnings of knowing yourself in an authentic and genuine way. Okay, so if you've made it up to this point, then you might be beginning to ask yourself some questions regarding the nature of this control, which means that you're actually on the right track. So this is the part of the video where we're actually going to switch gears a little bit and begin talking about the mechanisms to better understanding yourself and gaining introspection. So we'll start with a previously established concept and reverse engineer it for self-discovery. Locus of control refers to the mastery you feel you have over your own life. It's a crucial concept in social learning theory, and it's necessary if you want to understand yourself better, because as I alluded to before, you need to know what degree of control you have in order to further understand your objective effect in the world, because that has a reciprocal effect on how you understand yourself. For instance, if you feel you have a small inner locus of control, then you're more liable to understanding your day-to-day experiences as chaotic and may have a difficult time comprehending how to make effective changes. Now, having a small locus of control is a pretty difficult thing to manage because your proclivity toward anxiety is going to be heightened as a result, because you don't feel like you can make deliberate choices that have an actual effect. To use the example from earlier, it would be like opening the door for somebody and then expecting no reaction whatsoever to come from them, or something totally chaotic and out of control. This will likely leave you with an inaccurate representation of how the event unfolded, so you're barred from reflecting properly on your conduct. Now let's compare that with a higher locus of internal control. At first glance, you might notice that the inner circle has taken up more space and includes more categories, but if you look closely, you'd also notice that there are more overlapping features as well. Now I decided to represent it this way to illustrate what happens when you have a greater internal locus of control. It's to say that those things that are on the outside, they begin to become possible, like athletic potential. If you feel like you don't have much control of that, then you might be disincentivized from trying to work on it and make it higher. But in the case where you feel like you have more control of it, then you have the ability to really maximize your potential. And if you have a very high internal locus of control, then that means that you have the money or influence to be able to guide people's religious affiliations to some extent. And I mean, that varies, but nonetheless, that shows you your external effect on the world. So, what influences the locus of control? So to answer that succinctly, it's a combination of self-imposed control as well as physical limitations. In the case of the former, self-imposed control essentially equates to what we were talking about in the previous video when it comes to the problematic beliefs that you might get from yourself if you're dealing with something like trauma. If, for instance, you're the victim of some kind of assault, then you may believe that your vulnerability is heightened and then your proclivity to being damaged by something in your external world is greater because your self-image has a drastically lower quality and you would feel more impotent in matters involving conflict or making significant decisions. Now, the physical limitations that you might have represent a whole nother paradigm of what we're dealing with. If you have a physical disability, or you're lacking in money, or you're a young child, for instance, then you are likely being cut off from multiple routes of self-exploration. If you're born with no arms, you may never know the gratification of making a nice painting. If you have no discretionary spending because all of your money goes towards bills every month, then you may never know what it's like to be in Bali and how much you'd like it. If you're a child, then you don't have the faculties to understand yourself, and you live under your parents' control. So, if increased control of your life serves as a corollary to better understanding yourself, then the question becomes, how do I gain more control? And we'll answer that question as we transition into the next topic of this video, which is symbols. A very wise man once said, "The symbol is the best possible expression for something that cannot yet be fully known." But what does this mean? Well, earlier we talked about athletic potential as falling somewhere between the internal and external locus of control. But the symbol of athleticism can manifest itself as an ideal of what you are capable of through others, only then to be realized by you. Someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger symbolized this for millions of people around the world through a very public demonstration of what tireless work and dedication can accomplish, and essentially became the symbol of athletic potential for his fans because the results of his labor represent what is possible inside all of us. So while we may never know our athletic potential, let's say, we can better symbolize it through the ideal of what somebody else has accomplished, and so what that does is it helps give us reference for where we are now, where we could be, and then that helps us figure out where in between our true athletic potential would be. So even though we don't necessarily know it, we can better gauge where it would be or where we want it by trying to understand what we believe we are capable of and make an attempt to get there or go beyond it. Now, this is a crucial aspect of being able to control your own life because it directly addresses both the self-imposed control and the physical limitations that we talked about earlier regarding your locus of control. If you know what paintings speak to you, then you can better picture what it would mean to you to paint something like it and how not being able to defines that part of yourself. If you cannot go to faraway places, then hearing stories about them may help you understand how you would feel if you were there. And imagining what type of adult you want to become can help you map out your life if you are a child. Now, I don't say all of this just to map out how you can control your life better, but it's to help you distinguish what you can control and what you can't for the purpose of knowing yourself better objectively. The last thing I'm going to say about symbols is that they're a useful way to help you start to build up the structure for understanding yourself. But these symbols only function as a representation of our potential, and consequently, they alone do not define our life or who we are. If they did, then we would live dictated by events lacking grounding in reality and would be more likely to suffer from delusions, which may even lead to mania or psychosis. So in short, yes, symbols can help you get control of your life, and with that control, you can be pointed in a direction which helps you to better know yourself because you know what you are and are not capable of. But they need to be based in reality to avoid becoming delusional, and the best way to test this is through action. Okay, so now we're going to move away from the more ennobled and virtuous components of your potential to focus on a much darker but equally important struggle that we must all face every single day. The shadow can be defined as the culmination of urges and impulses we have learned to suppress or outright deny since childhood. It's these experiences which mold the structure of our ambivalence toward ourselves and others. It's another one of these paramount principles which can help us inform our understanding of ourselves and gain better control of who we are. But it's seriously difficult to integrate because it requires us to take an objective look at our presuppositions and our morality, especially if we need to integrate this into our own lives. Now, the dynamics we've already talked about make it difficult to understand the shadow because of its abstract nature and the complicated history that forms the structure for it. But at the core, what makes the shadow a shadow is the fact that it is seemingly anathema to the people we want to be or how we represent our ideals. As a result, we tend to reject that part of ourselves and we keep it hidden out of fear, justifiably or not, so we don't offend others and reap the consequences, or risk compromising the positive self image we have of ourselves. The problem here isn't that you're trying to learn to be a better person. The problem here is that through the vilification of these dark desires and taboo urges, you become detached from the things that presuppose those dynamics. And that might not always be a bad thing because you're capable of being unreasonable, especially as a child. But sometimes you'll have legitimate frustrations or grievances, which will be dramatically shut down by someone like your father. And in the worst case scenario, you may internalize conflict in general as something that should be avoided at all costs. If you despise these aggressive tendencies enough, especially when justified, then you may hate others for expressing this power, which can manifest as disdain not just towards your father, but other men in general. And as a result, you may go years being sad, angry, or anxious without ever actually knowing why. Okay, so there's a lot of dynamics that encompass this whole shadow concept, and if you have any extra questions, please feel free to leave a comment down below, because I'm going to discuss how you can move on to become aware of this dynamic, and then how to integrate it for your own betterment. And we'll start by talking about when the components of yourself that you hate become embodied in others. What is the worst thing one person can do to another? Giving this question serious thought is difficult because of its propensity to induce feelings of anger and disgust. What about the second worst thing? Or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth, or the 10th? Because it is the culmination of those things which comprise the shadow. Because every bad thing you're capable of thinking one person can do to another, you are capable of doing. It is when you ignore these components of yourself that it can fluctuate wildly out of control, and you can begin to see these traits in others and be motivated to acts far removed from your own best interest and that of your community at large. So if you want to get better control of yourself, then understand that the principal enemy you see in your life, be it disgusting, repugnant, worthless, terrible, whatever negative aspects you would attribute to that person, understand that those components lie dormant or active within you. Because if you act like you don't have the potential to be a terrible monster, then you'll be controlled by that aspect as it exists outside of your frame of reference. That is exactly what authors Christopher Perry and Rupert Tower explored in their book on Jung's shadow concept and the consequences of falling victim to it. If this happens, you will likely lose your ability to control your emotions, thoughts, and behaviors to some extent, which can give rise to depression, anxiety, manipulation, and even violence. Now, one of the major documented problems of failing to integrate the shadow comes not from just not being able to understand these components about yourself, but it's being controlled by them. Let's take, for instance, a guy who prides himself on being brutally honest. You know, he might say something along the lines of, I just say what everyone else is too afraid to say, or be confused when people don't respond positively to the feedback that he's giving them. For instance, at work, he might cut people down in meetings or with friends, he may mock vulnerability, but the element of the shadow makes itself apparent when he feels a surge of satisfaction, followed immediately by justification. And if he goes on without realizing that conflict energizes him, or that he becomes irritated when conversations turn warm and sincere, then that's how you know that the shadow truly has control over you through anger. But what about when this aspect manifests even more covertly? Let's take a woman who sees herself as strong, self-respecting, or emotionally independent. She realizes she's been a people pleaser, and that she's done accommodating others and being taken advantage of. Now she has a new power. When other people disappoint her, she doesn't need to make a big deal out about it. She just withdraws from the situation because she's protecting herself. She doesn't owe access to anyone, and people have always taken advantage of her anyways. So what's going on here? Withdrawal has taught her that pain is an endemic part of relationships, and she's confused autonomy and isolation as being the same thing, so now to function healthily, she needs to be autonomous. These new feelings of power and protection are now making the decisions for her, and the longer they go on, the more the lines between self-respect and dignity will get blurred with emotional numbness and disappointment. Alright, so now that we've gone over the shadow and we understand how it emerges, develops, and operates, and then some potential consequences it has when it's left out of control, we're going to talk about how to integrate it. Now, if you're wondering why that's necessary, the whole purpose of this video is to help you gain deliberate control over your emotions, behaviors, and thoughts in order to be able to secure what you want in your own life. And thus far, understanding yourself has been the principal way that we've gone about doing so. So, understanding the darker elements of yourself that you detest will help you avoid negative emotionality by eliminating the unconscious tendency to navigate your life around your worst proclivities, thus never understanding them. And we'll take time to discuss how to do that in this next section. Self-acceptance and self-compassion are the cornerstone of shadow integration, because the premise of psychotherapy is that self-rejection strengthens unconscious influence, while self-acceptance weakens it. If you have your own back as you move through life, then you will have greater control over interpsychic chaos, fundamentally because you are in less danger. And this is a well-studied phenomenon in psychology. There's ample evidence to suggest that having a higher self-image, for example, decreases anxiety, and then also there exists corresponding neurological research to back up those claims. A well-cited study titled "The Mediating Effects of Self-Esteem on Anxiety and Emotion Regulation" not only substantiates these claims, but additionally found that low self-esteem contributes significantly to increased anxiety and intentionally avoiding objects of distress. And, as you might have guessed, trying to avoid the things that are actively causing you distress serves primarily to increase that feeling. So if you're starting to understand these dynamics and just how much they matter, the appeal that I make to you is to become a very, very good friend to yourself. Because the nucleus of self-image, which is what all of this is about, rests on your relationship to yourself. In a lot of ways, you really are like your own boss or doctor, because a part of you functions as an overseer that directs you in what you should be doing. This boss has their own predilections, which will mediate praise and reward or disappointment and punishment. But at the same time, we're like our own patient or employee who's responsible for marshaling the resources together to be able to meet the needs of our superior. So you tell me, what type of relationship is best here? Is it better to have an adversarial relationship where your boss has high expectations of you and you're under pressure to perform? Or is it better to have a more amicable relationship based on trust and security? Now, this is a pretty big question which might deserve its own video entirely, because sometimes it's worth it to be harsh on yourself, especially if you're looking for short-term rewards. But when it comes to knowing yourself and controlling your life, it really is in your best interest to make a relationship with yourself based off amicability and compassion to avoid ego dystonia. And additionally, it's necessary to have harmony with yourself to increase ego syntonicity, thus getting to know yourself better. So at this point, we've discussed the ways you interact with the world around you and how you can get deliberate control of your perception through recognizing symbols and making conscious decisions on the way you act and the choices you make, especially in what seem like trivial cases. And to reiterate what I said at the beginning of this video, you can engage in behaviors deliberately to become the ideal version of yourself and do what's in your best interest so that you can build up that continuity of your self-image that has objective properties. Now, if it was that easy to understand yourself, I wouldn't have to make this video because there are billions of other videos out there with self-help gurus who've already touched on the same topic. The real problem, which I discussed extensively in my last video, is really what you find here, and that's when it comes to mood. Because the way that we feel can either stop us from achieving the things that we want to do in our day-to-day, or promote us to grow in ways which we want to idealistically reach. So in this last section, we're really going to get deep into this axiomatic problem with mood, and discuss how you can build continuity in your emotional reactions. All for the purpose of better understanding yourself, and gaining more control in your own life. Now, to reiterate, the reason why mood is a core feature for why we can't get to understand ourselves fully is because it hinders our initial perception of events and alters each stage of memory. So that means even if you have an understanding of yourself as this moody person, it still means that your perception of yourself is going to base widely on the mood that you're feeling on any given day or hour. So the premise of this section will be answering the question, how can we get our mood under control? Now, I touched on this earlier in the video regarding behaviors and symbols, as understanding these things and trying to moderate them deliberately will cultivate a better mood, but mood also functions as an independent factor, which will of course influence your behaviors and symbols. A question I often ask my clients is, how long can you go without thinking? Now, the reason I ask this question is because thoughts have a tendency to influence emotions and vice versa. As depicted here, the CBT triangle is a very well-known illustration in modern psychology, and it clearly delineates not just these interactions, but also between thoughts and behaviors, as well as behaviors and emotions, because the response you get from behaviors will either validate or dismantle your feelings. So if you're like most people, then your answer to the question is probably no more than a few seconds, which would really suggest something to you about your emotions and your behaviors. Now, there's a lot of reasons as to why we cannot deliberately focus for longer, including both cognitive limitations and external influences that serve to distract us. But suffice to say, this dynamic creates a barrier for getting control of our mood. But that's okay, because it's a skill that you can improve. For instance, there are various studies that have demonstrated that those who have multiple years of experience meditating perform better not just on deliberately not thinking about anything, but also focusing attention on any given activity or thought for longer, with self-reports and neuroscientific data to back up said claims. Basically, meditating is the most straightforward way to address mood, and the longer you practice it, the more effective it becomes. Now, there are a plethora of meditation types and techniques, but learning about them and practicing the sort that you have the strongest predilection for will contribute strongly to your accessibility in the practice and promote you to continue engaging with it. So I've covered a lot of ground here and used a psychological perspective to analyze the things that go into knowing yourself and having control of your own life. You now have some tools to help you explore these dynamics as well as make effective change towards your goals or ideals. And if you stay true to yourself and practice these things, then your own morality may even unveil itself to you in the long term. But the problem here is that life is long and difficult, so being aware of your adaptations can be especially challenging during a crisis, because you will need to acknowledge your own limitations and accept your failures, of which there will probably be many. But if you make a good companion out of yourself, and you remain open to what's happening around you, then it'll be all the easier to control your life. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next one.